There is a version of World War I that lives in bronze. It stands in town squares and railway stations and village greens across Europe and North America and Australia and beyond. It has a name carved below it, sometimes dozens of names, sometimes hundreds. It has a date. It has a phrase, usually something about sacrifice, something about duty, something about not forgetting. That version of the war is the one taught in schools and repeated in ceremonies and preserved in the careful language of official history. It is a version built on selection, on what was chosen to be remembered, and more importantly, on what was quietly set aside. This script is about what was set aside, not because it was forgotten through carelessness, not because the records were lost, but because an enormous institutional machinery, governments, military commands, medical establishments, press censors, and the families of the dead themselves collectively decided that certain truths about what World War I actually looked like from the inside were better left unspoken. Not suppressed with dramatic finality, not locked in vaults with theatrical secrecy, but simply not repeated, not included, not forwarded to the next generation in any form that would allow full comprehension of what the war's daily mechanics actually required of the human body and the human mind. The war lasted 4 years and 3 months. It consumed somewhere between 17 and 20 million lives, depending on how you count the dead from disease and the dead from wounds that took weeks to finish their work. It wounded approximately 21 million more. It left an unknown number. Historians still argue about the figure, with injuries to the mind that had no name at the time, no recognized diagnostic category, no agreed-upon treatment, and no systematic pathway back to ordinary life. These people were simply sent home and expected to resume. What follows is not a list of atrocities in the dramatic sense. It is not a catalogue of individual cruelties or exceptional villainies. It is something quieter and, in its way, more disturbing than either of those things. It is a description of routine, of the things that happened every day, that were managed and recorded and processed, and in many cases simply accepted as the operational baseline of modern industrial war. The things that became, in the language of the institutions running the war, normal. The first routine that the records reveal, and the one that shaped everything else, was the management of distance. Not physical distance, though that was real enough, with the Western Front stretching nearly 500 miles from the English Channel to the Swiss border, but the deliberate construction and maintenance of distance between the experience of the men in the trenches and the understanding of the people who had sent them there. This was not accidental. It was organized. Britain established a press bureau within days of declaring war in August 1914. Its function was to review all dispatches from journalists near the front and remove anything deemed harmful to public morale or operationally sensitive. France had an equivalent body. Germany had one. Every major belligerent nation created some version of this apparatus, and all of them functioned in roughly the same way. They allowed the language of sacrifice and heroism and national purpose to pass through freely, and they stopped the language of physical reality. A correspondent who wrote about a man's courage could publish without difficulty. A correspondent who described what an artillery shell actually did to a human body when it landed in a crowded trench. The specific clinical details of what remained afterward, of what the stretcher bearers had to collect, of what the medical officers had to process, faced immediate censorship and, if persistent, accreditation removal. Field censorship was equally systematic. Every letter written by a soldier in the British Expeditionary Force passed through censorship. Officers censored their own men's mail and submitted their own letters for censorship by superior officers. The instructions given to censors were not primarily about military secrecy, though that was part of it. They were about emotional content. Letters describing extreme suffering, letters expressing hopelessness, letters containing detailed descriptions of wounds or deaths of specific individuals. These were stopped. Letters saying things were hard, but the men were bearing up. Letters expressing determination. Letters with the kind of controlled resignation that could be read as stoic acceptance. These were forwarded. Across 4 years, This filter shaped what families at home understood about the war their sons and husbands were fighting. The soldiers understood this. Many of them developed a parallel language, a way of writing that satisfied the censor while conveying something else entirely to people who knew how to read it. References to being tired in ways that went beyond physical exhaustion. References to the weather that carried meanings no meteorologist would recognize. References to friends who were no longer mentioned, whose names simply dropped from correspondence without explanation, because there was no approved vocabulary for what had happened to them. The gap between what the letters said and what they meant was itself a kind of trauma imposed by the institution on both the writer and the reader. The second routine was the rotation system, and understanding it requires understanding the geography of the Western Front in a way that most popular histories do not fully convey. The trenches were not a single line. They were a system, 3 or 4 lines deep in most sectors, connected by communication trenches running perpendicular to the front, with rest areas and support areas extending miles behind the actual front line. A unit in the British or French or German system would typically spend a period in the front trenches, the actual first line, closest to the enemy, then rotate back to the support trenches, then back further to rest billets, then forward again. The cycle varied by unit and sector and operational situation, but in broad terms a division might spend somewhere between 4 and 8 days in the front line at a stretch during quiet periods. This sounds on paper manageable. What the rotation records reveal when examined closely is something different. The rotation system was designed to keep a maximum number of men functional for the maximum amount of time. It was not designed around the question of what a human being could endure without lasting damage. It was designed around what a human being could endure without becoming immediately non-functional. These are not the same question, and the difference between them is where most of the psychological casualties of the war were generated. Men returned to the front line after days in the support trenches or rest billets, carrying everything they had accumulated on their previous tours, the memory of what they had seen, the sounds that had not stopped running through their heads during the nights in the rest billets, the specific faces of the men who had been beside them and were not beside them any longer. The rotation system moved bodies. It did not address what the front line was doing to the interior life of the men whose bodies it moved. That question was, for the first years of the war, not part of the institutional calculus at all. The third routine was the matter of the dead. Every army in World War I developed out of necessity a bureaucratic system for managing the dead, and what these systems reveal is the scale at which death became an administrative problem. On any given day on the Western Front, even during periods that military historians classify as quiet, men were dying. Sniper fire, shell fragments from harassing artillery, accidents, disease, the infrastructure collapse of a trench section, a raid that went wrong. The numbers were not the numbers of a major offensive, but they were continuous and they required processing. The British system, which is among the best documented, involved the regimental stretcher bearers, the regimental aid post, the advanced dressing stations, the casualty clearing stations, and the base hospitals, with the dead moving through a parallel administrative channel involving graves registration units. A man who died in the front trench was, if possible, removed by stretcher bearers, a task that itself carried significant mortality as stretcher bearers were not protected under any convention that reliably held in practice, and eventually reached a burial point. His identification was recorded. His personal effects were collected, inventoried, and sent through a bureaucratic process that eventually resulted in them being delivered to his next of kin. The personal effects process is one of the most revealing windows into how the institution managed death. There were detailed written instructions about what could and could not be returned to families. Items that might cause distress, damaged items, items with blood on them, were to be cleaned or, if cleaning was impossible, withheld. The letter informing a family of a death was standardized. It expressed regret in set phrases. It noted that the man had died of wounds or died in action or died instantaneously. the last phrase being used regardless of whether it was true, because died instantaneously meant no suffering, and no suffering was what the institution had decided families needed to hear. The graves registration units kept records of burial locations with varying degrees of precision. In the chaos of major offensives, men were buried where they fell or where they could be moved to, and the location recorded in the burial register was sometimes accurate and sometimes an approximation, and sometimes, when the front had moved and the ground had been shelled repeatedly, simply wrong. After the war, when the Imperial War Graves Commission began its work, they found that a significant proportion of the recorded burial locations could not be matched to actual graves. The bodies had been moved by subsequent shelling, or the markers had been destroyed, or the records had been lost or were too imprecise to be useful. This is where the names on the memorials come from. The Menin Gate in Ypres, with its 54,000 names, the Thiepval Memorial with its 72,000. These are not memorials to men whose graves are known. They are memorials to men whose bodies the system lost track of. The fourth routine was what the medical establishment called wastage. This word appears throughout British military, medical and logistical records with a frequency and casualness that takes time to absorb. Wastage referred to the rate at which a unit lost men, to death, to wounds, to sickness, and it was a planning factor. When staff officers calculated how long a unit could maintain combat effectiveness in a given sector, wastage rates were part of the equation. Normal wastage in a quiet sector, higher wastage during active operations. The word itself reflects the cognitive framework that institutional management of the war required. Men were a resource, and they were consumed, and the rate of consumption needed to be projected and planned for. Replacement drafts were organized around wastage estimates. A division going into a major offensive was allocated replacements based on projected casualty figures. If the actual casualties exceeded the projection, the replacement system struggled to keep pace. If casualties were below projection, a rarer circumstance, the surplus replacements were redirected. The system was not indifferent to individual men in the way that pure abstraction would suggest. Commanders at the unit level often knew their men well and experienced their deaths as genuine personal losses. But the system, the institutional architecture within which those commanders operated, processed men as quantities. It had to. The war could not have been run any other way given its scale. That is precisely the point. The scale of the war required its participants to be managed in ways that would be recognized as dehumanizing in any other context, and the system accomplished this by developing a specialized vocabulary, wastage, attrition, replacements, effectives, that allowed the management to proceed without the full emotional weight of what was being managed, pressing too hard on the people doing the managing. The fifth routine concerns rations and what the ration records reveal about the physical condition of frontline troops across the war's 4 years. The official ration scale for British soldiers, established early in the war, was generous on paper. It included meat, bread, biscuit, vegetables, tea, sugar, jam, and various supplementary items. What the records of supply officers and the complaints in officers' diaries and the reports of medical officers actually show is that the official ration scale and what men in the front trenches actually received were frequently different things, and the difference was not small. The problem was not primarily shortage at the source. Britain and France were not starving nations. The problem was the supply chain running forward to the front line, particularly during active operations and in sectors where forward movement was difficult. In the Ypres salient, where the terrain had been churned by years of shelling into a landscape where wheeled transport was nearly impossible, and even foot movement was dangerous and exhausting, bringing rations forward to the front line required carrying parties moving at night through conditions that resulted in significant losses of both the carriers and the rations they were carrying. Men spent days in the front line receiving reduced rations or no hot food at all, surviving on whatever had been brought forward before conditions deteriorated. The physical effects of this were documented by medical officers and largely not transmitted upward through the reporting chain. A medical officer noting that men in a particular sector were showing signs of nutritional deficiency was recording a medical fact. Whether that fact influenced operational planning was a different question. The records suggest that in most cases it did not, because the operational requirements of maintaining the front line took precedence over the physical welfare of the men maintaining it. This was not a decision made consciously by any individual. It was the emergent behavior of an institutional system in which military objectives and resource management calculations occupied the decision-making space where consideration of individual welfare would otherwise sit. Hot food, specifically, became a psychological as well as physical issue. Men who had spent multiple days eating cold or no food in conditions of extreme stress described the arrival of a hot meal, when it came, in terms that go well beyond nutritional satisfaction. The records of field kitchens and the logistics of getting hot food to frontline troops are, in their way, a detailed record of institutional failure to meet a basic human need, managed by a system that had classified meeting that need as operationally desirable rather than operationally essential. The sixth routine was the matter of sleep, and this is where the records become particularly disturbing if you spend time with them. The standard tour of frontline duty required men to maintain a stand-to, a full alert posture, at dawn and dusk, the times considered most dangerous for enemy attack. Between those periods, in theory, some men could rest while others kept watch. In practice, the demands on manpower in a frontline trench, the constant requirement for working parties to repair wire, maintain the trench structure, carry ammunition, man listening posts in no man's land at night, and perform the dozens of other tasks that trench maintenance required, meant that the theoretical rest periods were frequently consumed by labor. The result was a chronic, cumulative sleep deficit that military medical officers documented with some precision, particularly as the war progressed, and they developed better frameworks for understanding its effects. Men in the front line during active periods were routinely operating on 2 or 3 hours of broken sleep per 24 hours for days at a stretch. The effects on judgment, on emotional regulation, on the ability to interpret sensory information accurately, were well understood by the medical profession even in 1914. What was not well understood was how to address those effects within the operational framework of a war that required the front line to be continuously manned. Shell shock, the term the war generated for what would later be understood as combat-related psychological injury, was in many cases built from layers of sleep deprivation accumulated over weeks and months, combined with the specific terror of artillery bombardment, combined with the deaths of men who had been close companions, combined with the moral weight of what the war required its participants to do and witness. The records of shell shock cases at casualty clearing stations and base hospitals frequently note that the patient had not slept properly in days or weeks before the presenting incident. This detail was recorded and then largely ignored in treatment planning, because the institutional response to shell shock was concerned primarily with returning men to duty rather than addressing the conditions that had produced the breakdown. The seventh routine is the one that the medical records of the war make most uncomfortable: the treatment of psychological casualties, and specifically the institutional determination of what constituted a legitimate wound versus what constituted cowardice or malingering. This distinction was not merely clinical. It had consequences that included court-martial, and in cases adjudicated as cowardice in the face of the enemy, execution. Britain executed 306 of its own soldiers during World War I for offences including cowardice, desertion, and quitting post. France executed an estimated 600 to 700, with the exact figure disputed and the records of certain execution waves, particularly those following the mutinies of 1917, still not fully transparent. Germany executed a smaller number by official record, though the reliability of those records has been questioned. The executions were carried out by firing squad, composed of men from the condemned soldier's own unit, a practice specifically designed to ensure that the men who would be most tempted to desert witnessed the consequences at close range. The medical dimension of these cases is where the records become most revealing. Men who were executed for cowardice or desertion frequently had documented histories of symptoms that later medical understanding would recognize as severe post-traumatic stress. The private who absented himself from the line after witnessing his entire section destroyed by a single shell. The soldier who froze under fire and could not be moved. The man who simply walked away from his unit one night and was found days later wandering behind the lines with no memory of his movements. These cases appear in the court-martial records not as medical presentations but as disciplinary matters. The regimental medical officer was sometimes consulted. In cases where the medical officer gave evidence of psychological disturbance, it might or might not affect the verdict. In many cases it did not. The system was operating from a set of assumptions about the human mind that were already outdated by 1914 in civilian medical practice, but remained dominant in military medical culture because the alternative, acknowledging that the experience of modern artillery warfare could break any man regardless of character or willpower, had implications for the management of the army that the institution was not prepared to absorb. If mental breakdown was a medical condition rather than a moral failing, then the men being executed were not guilty of anything. If they were not guilty of anything, then the entire disciplinary architecture that kept other men from leaving was built on something other than justice. The institution did not follow that line of reasoning. The disciplinary architecture was maintained, the executions continued. The medical records that might have supported a different verdict were interpreted within the existing framework or set aside. Decades later, in 2006, the British government issued a blanket pardon to all 306 executed soldiers. The pardon contained no finding that any specific execution had been unjust. It was an acknowledgement without an accounting. The eighth routine was the specific management of gas casualties, and here the records intersect with a form of institutional denial that operated across all the major armies simultaneously. When Germany first used large-scale chlorine gas at Ypres in April 1915, the Allied medical establishment was unprepared for what it produced. Men who survived the initial exposure arrived at dressing stations with injuries that the existing medical taxonomy did not adequately describe. The gas attacked the respiratory system in ways that were not immediately fatal, but produced a progressive deterioration that could take days to kill. Men who seemed functional immediately after exposure could collapse and die 48 hours later as their damaged lungs filled with fluid. The medical response to gas casualties was improvised under pressure and remained inadequate throughout the war. The protective equipment, the masks, the respirators, improved significantly as the war progressed and as the chemistry of the gas war evolved, with phosgene and mustard gas adding new injury profiles to the chlorine of the early attacks. But the treatment of men who had been gassed, particularly men with severe mustard gas exposure, remained largely supportive rather than curative. The burns that mustard gas produced, both on the skin and on the mucous membranes and respiratory tract, were managed symptomatically. Men with severe exposure were kept comfortable, their pain managed to the degree that available analgesics allowed, and they either recovered or they did not. The casualty figures for gas were systematically undercounted in official records, and this was not accidental. Gas casualties who died quickly were recorded as killed in action. Gas casualties who survived but with lasting respiratory damage were recorded in ways that made the connection to gas exposure difficult to trace. Gas casualties who developed blindness, a common effect of mustard gas exposure, were treated in specialist centers, but the long-term effects on men who returned to civilian life with damaged lungs and compromised vision entered the general population of war wounded without a separate accounting that would have made the true human cost of the gas war visible. Part of the reason for this accounting obscuration was legal. The use of poison gas was recognized by all parties as a violation of existing international conventions, specifically the Hague Declarations of 1899 and 1907, which prohibited the use of poison or poisoned weapons. All major belligerents violated these conventions, and all of them developed official positions that their particular use of gas did not constitute a violation because of various technical distinctions. An accurate accounting of gas casualties would have made these positions harder to maintain. The casualty records were therefore kept in forms that served the institutional narrative rather than the historical record. The ninth routine was the matter of live burial, which appears in the medical and personal records of the war with a frequency that is jarring when you first encounter it and deeply troubling when you begin to understand how systematically it was managed and how thoroughly it was removed from the public narrative of the war. Artillery bombardment, which was the dominant feature of the Western Front experience for all 4 years, did not only kill and wound men, it buried them. A shell landing in or near a trench section could collapse the walls and bury the men in it under tons of earth. In many cases, these men were killed by the blast or the collapse. In some cases, they were not. The stretcher bearer and working party records contain accounts of men dug out of collapsed trench sections hours after burial, alive. They also contain accounts, quieter and less frequent but present, of men dug out who had been alive at the time of burial, but were not alive when reached. The mathematics of this, the time it took to identify where men were buried, the time required to dig through the disturbed earth of a shelled trench, the limitations imposed by ongoing artillery fire that made the digging itself dangerous, produced a casualty category that the official records did not have a clean way to classify. These men were killed in action. They were, in a technical sense. But they were killed in action over the course of hours rather than instantly, and they died aware of their situation, in darkness, unable to move, with diminishing air. The psychological literature of the war contains references to a syndrome, not formally named, but described in consistent terms across multiple accounts, that involved an extreme and specific terror of enclosed spaces, of darkness, of the sensation of earth or debris pressing from above. This syndrome appeared with notable frequency in men who had served in sectors with heavy bombardment and high rates of trench collapse. The connection between this presentation and the experience of live burial or near live burial, of being present when others were buried, of participating in the digging out of men who had been buried, was understood by some of the more perceptive medical observers of the war. It was not incorporated into any systematic treatment framework. The men who presented with this terror were classified within the general shell shock category and managed accordingly. The 10th routine involves the administrative processing of missing soldiers and the specific prolonged agony this produced for families in a way that the official record-keeping systems were not designed to address and did not address adequately for years after the war ended. When a soldier went missing, when he simply did not appear in any casualty list, was not found wounded at any dressing station, was not recorded as a prisoner of war, his official status was missing, and this status could persist for an extraordinarily long time. The bureaucratic reason for the delay in moving a missing soldier's status to killed in action was legitimate on its face. A man who was missing might be a prisoner of war, and prisoner of war lists took time to compile and cross-reference. Changing a man's status prematurely and then having him reappear alive created administrative complications and inflicted an additional emotional injury on his family. So the institution waited. It waited often for years. The human consequence of this waiting was a species of extended grief that the records of welfare organizations working with soldiers' families during and after the war document in detail. A family with a missing son or husband was suspended between hope and mourning, unable to fully commit to either, for as long as the official status remained unresolved. They could not mourn in the socially recognized way that a confirmed death permitted. They could not hope in any grounded sense because the evidence for hoping was non-existent. They were held in an institutional limbo created by paperwork, and the institution was not particularly concerned with resolving it for their sake. After the war, the demand from families with missing men for information, any information, about what had happened to their relatives produced an industry, not a charitable industry, a commercial one. Men who claimed to have served near the area where a missing soldier had last been seen, who claimed to have information about the circumstances of his death, sold that information to grieving families. The information was almost always fabricated. The families were almost always aware at some level that it might be fabricated and paid anyway, because the need for any account of what had happened was stronger than the skepticism that might have protected them. The institution that had created the missing category in the first place had no systematic response to this exploitation. The 11th routine was the management of trench foot, which in the early years of the war reached epidemic proportions, and which the medical records treat with a clinical detachment that obscures what the condition actually meant for the men who developed it. Trench foot resulted from prolonged exposure to cold, wet conditions, specifically from standing or sitting in waterlogged trenches for extended periods without the ability to dry the feet, change into dry socks, or restore normal circulation. The condition began as numbness and swelling. It progressed to blistering, discoloration, and in severe cases to tissue death that required amputation. In the winter of 1914 to 1915, before the British Army had developed any systematic response to the problem, the casualty figures from trench foot in some sectors rivaled the casualty figures from enemy action. This was understood at the command level. General Sir Douglas Haig, who commanded 1st Army and would later command the entire BEF, was informed of the scale of the problem. The response was the development of a rotation system specifically designed to allow men to dry their feet, combined with a requirement for officers to inspect the feet of their men regularly, and a supply chain improvement to ensure that dry socks were available more consistently. What makes the trench foot records historically significant is not the medical details, but the command accountability dimension. Officers whose men developed excessive rates of trench foot were subject to disciplinary action. This created an incentive structure that in practice led to some under-reporting of trench foot cases at the unit level, because a medical officer who reported his unit's full trench foot burden was potentially implicating the unit's officers in a failure of care. The records of some units therefore show trench foot rates that medical historians believe are significantly below the actual incidence. The disease was managed bureaucratically in a way that created a reporting distortion, and the resulting record is therefore not an accurate account of how many men actually suffered from it. The 12th routine is the one that the letters and diaries of frontline soldiers return to with a persistence that makes it impossible to overlook, even though it almost never appeared in any official document in a form that captured its full character. This was the specific quality of waiting, the waiting that was the dominant experiential texture of trench life for most men most of the time. Not the attacks, not the raids, not the bombardments, which were episodic and intense, but the long periods in between, during which nothing was happening in any operationally significant sense, and men sat in a trench and waited for something to happen, unable to move freely, unable to see more than a few yards in most directions, exposed to weather, to insects, to the smell of the trench, to the presence of the dead who could not always be removed, and to the knowledge that any moment might bring an artillery shell, a sniper's round, a gas alarm, or any of the other random lethal possibilities that constituted the background radiation of frontline existence. The psychological effect of this waiting was understood by some medical observers in the war, particularly those who had read or were reading the emerging psychological literature of the period, as a specific kind of stress distinct from the acute stress of combat. Chronic, low-level, inescapable threat exposure. The impossibility of either fully relaxing or fully engaging with the danger. The absence of any action that the individual could take to reduce the risk or control the situation. The repetitiveness of the environment, day after day, with minimal variation in the stimuli available. These are conditions that the psychology of the 20th century would come to recognize as producing distinctive and lasting harm. In 1915 and 1916, they were simply the conditions of being at the front. The unit diaries, the official daily records kept by every British unit, capture this waiting in their own way, not by describing it but by revealing it in the entries that read, on day after day after day, nothing to report, or situation normal or routine or quiet night. These phrases, in their repetition, are the administrative notation of an experience that was anything but quiet inside the heads of the men producing them. The 13th routine was the management of rats in the trench system, which appears in personal accounts of the war with such frequency and specificity that it constitutes a distinct feature of the front-line experience, and which official reports and historical accounts have consistently treated as an anecdote rather than a systematic condition with measurable effects. The trenches of the Western Front supported rat populations of extraordinary density, fed on the refuse of millions of men and on the bodies of the dead that could not be recovered or that had been buried in the trench walls themselves. The rats were large. They were bold. They moved through the trenches at night in numbers that personal accounts describe in terms that are difficult to read without experiencing a visceral response. The effects were not merely psychological, though the psychological effects were real and documented. Rats spread leptospirosis, also called Weil's disease, a bacterial infection transmitted through rat urine that contaminated the standing water that was ubiquitous in the trenches. Men who developed leptospirosis presented with symptoms including fever, severe headache, muscle pain, and in serious cases, jaundice and kidney failure. The disease was not well understood in the early years of the war and was frequently misdiagnosed. Men who died from it were recorded as dying from fever or nephritis or a non-specific infectious disease. The connection to rat infestation, and therefore to the conditions of the trenches, was established by military medical researchers during the war, but did not substantially change the conditions that allowed the rat population to thrive. The sanitation records of various sectors of the Western Front document the rat problem in the language of logistical management. Quantities of rat poison distributed, quantities of traps deployed, instructions for the disposal of unit refuse that would reduce the food supply available to the rat population. These records exist alongside personal accounts that describe conditions that suggest the sanitation measures were inadequate to the scale of the problem. The rats were a permanent feature of the trench environment. The institution managed them to the extent it could, and absorbed the remainder as an acceptable baseline condition of frontline life. The 14th routine was the specific way that the British Army managed the bodies of its officers as distinct from the bodies of its other ranks, a distinction that reveals something essential about the class architecture of the institution and about the limits of the equality that military service was sometimes claimed to produce. Officers who died in or near the front lines were treated, where possible, as individual deaths with individual burial rights. Their personal effects were collected with greater care. The notification of their families was more detailed and more personal. The regimental records of their deaths were more extensive. The graves of officers were more likely to be individually marked and more likely to survive in identifiable form. Other ranks were buried in larger, less precisely documented graves. Their personal effects went through the same process, but the bureaucratic attention was thinner. The notification letters were more standardized. The record of their deaths in unit documents was briefer. The graves registration work for other ranks, while genuine in its intentions, operated at a scale and pace that produced less precise results. This differential was not a matter of any explicit policy stating that officers were worth more. It was the emergent result of a system that had different administrative procedures for different ranks, and those different procedures produced different outcomes in terms of the historical record that each individual left behind. The consequence is that the history of World War I, as it can be reconstructed from the written record, is disproportionately a history of officers. The letters and diaries that survived, that were preserved by families, that were donated to archives, that were published, these are predominantly the records of men who were commissioned. The experiences of the larger number of men who were not officers are reconstructible only in aggregate through the official records that process them and through the relatively smaller number of other rank personal accounts that survived. The war was experienced primarily by men without commissions. The historical record of it is dominated by men who had them. The 15th routine involves the management of venereal disease, which the medical records of all major armies treat with a combination of clinical documentation and institutional discomfort that is itself historically revealing. Venereal disease rates among frontline troops were high across all armies throughout the war for reasons that required no elaborate explanation. Large numbers of young men, extended periods of stress and fear, alternating with periods of release in rear areas, available sex workers in towns behind the front, and insufficient access to prophylactic measures or, where prophylactics were available, insufficient institutional commitment to their use. The British Army's approach to venereal disease underwent a significant evolution during the war. Early policy was influenced by moral and religious objections to any institutional facilitation of sexual activity, including the distribution of prophylactics, on the grounds that making infection less likely would encourage behavior that was morally undesirable. The consequence of this position was a venereal disease rate that removed men from duty for periods measured in weeks, during which they required medical treatment and were unavailable for frontline service. When the operational cost of this approach became sufficiently visible, pragmatic considerations began to displace moral ones, and prophylaxis distribution and early treatment programs expanded. The records of men who contracted venereal disease during the war were managed in specific ways to protect them from certain consequences, specifically the loss of pay and benefits that some regulations attached to self-inflicted wounds or self-generated incapacity. Venereal disease occupied an ambiguous category in this framework. Was it a self-inflicted condition in the regulatory sense? The Army moved back and forth on this question over the course of the war, and the records reflect that ambiguity. The men who appear in venereal disease treatment records were, in many cases, experiencing one of the very few occasions during their service when they were removed from immediate danger and treated with something approaching physical care. The medical records do not capture this dimension. They record diagnosis and treatment and return to duty, the interior experience of a man lying in a hospital bed away from the front, even for a reason he might find embarrassing, was not the institution's concern. The 16th routine was the specific processing of prisoners of war, and what makes the records of this processing historically significant is not the conditions of the prison camps, which have been documented extensively elsewhere, but the moment of capture itself, which occupied a peculiar and almost entirely unacknowledged space in the institutional framework of the war. Surrender was, on paper, a recognized and legal act under the laws of war. A man who laid down his arms and signaled surrender was entitled to protection. The reality of the Western Front produced conditions in which this entitlement was intermittently honored and intermittently not. The records of prisoner handling, unit war diaries, after-action reports, prisoner statements taken at processing centers contain a pattern that historians have documented without it becoming part of the general public understanding of the war. Prisoners taken in the immediate heat of combat, particularly during assault operations where the front was fluid and units were mixed, faced significantly greater risk than prisoners taken under more controlled circumstances. The reasons given in the records, when reasons are given at all, involve operational necessity. The difficulty of managing prisoners while an advance was continuing, the impossibility of providing escorts, the danger of leaving armed men behind the advancing line. What the records do not capture, because the records were not designed to capture it, is the number of men who attempted to surrender and were killed in that attempt. Estimates of this number, based on comparative analysis of casualty figures and prisoner of war totals in specific operations, suggest that the gap between the number of men who attempted surrender and the number who successfully completed it was not insignificant. The gap was filled by men who were killed, by artillery that had no way to distinguish surrendering men from fighting ones, by soldiers who did not or could not honor the surrender, by the sheer chaos of assault operations in terrain that made communication and recognition nearly impossible. The institution processed the men who successfully surrendered through the prisoner of war system. It did not count or acknowledge the men who did not. The 17th routine was the use of stimulants and sedatives in the management of frontline troops. which the medical records document with a candor that was never translated into the public narrative of the war. Rum was the most visible and officially sanctioned stimulant, issued as a standard ration before trench raids and major assaults in the British Army. The rum ration was not a trivial quantity. It was a substantial measure, intended to produce a specific physiological and psychological effect. Men going over the top of a trench toward positions defended by machine guns were going to experience a level of fear that would, in a certain percentage of them, prevent effective function. The rum ration was, in institutional terms, a tool for managing that percentage. Less visible in the official record, but documented in the accounts of medical officers and in the pharmaceutical supply records of the war, were the various other chemical interventions used to manage the psychological condition of troops. Bromides were administered to men showing signs of acute anxiety, both at the front and in hospitals. Chloral hydrate was used to produce sleep in men who had become incapable of sleeping without chemical assistance. The use of cocaine in various medicinal preparations, as an anesthetic and as a stimulant, was documented in the early years of the war, before concern about addiction produced some regulatory attention. The supply records for these substances at casualty clearing stations and field hospitals show a pattern of use that reflects the institutional understanding that the psychological condition of troops was a medical management problem to be addressed with available pharmaceutical tools, and that the alternative, addressing the conditions producing the psychological distress, was not within the medical institution's remit. The morphine records are particularly revealing. Morphine was administered to seriously wounded men at casualty clearing stations and to men in severe psychological distress, in addition to those with physical pain. The records note morphine administered to cases of acute shell shock, not because those men were in physical pain, but because morphine produced a sedation that quieted the presentation and allowed the man to be processed. The treatment of the underlying condition was deferred to a later point in the evacuation chain, or in some cases, was not provided at all. The morphine record is, in part, a record of an institution managing the presentation of suffering rather than its cause. The 18th routine was the treatment of self-inflicted wounds, which the records approach with a care that reveals the institutional stakes involved. A self-inflicted wound, a man who shot himself in the hand or foot to escape the front line, was a crime under military law. It was also a data point. If the rate of self-inflicted wounds in a unit was high, it suggested something about the condition of that unit, about the morale of its men, about the adequacy of its leadership. The institutional response to self-inflicted wounds was therefore not only disciplinary, but also quietly a diagnostic tool for assessing unit deterioration. Medical officers were required to report suspected self-inflicted wounds. The suspicion was based on clinical evidence, the range at which a gunshot wound had been inflicted, the angle of the wound track, the presence or absence of powder burns, and on contextual factors. A wounded man who could not produce a credible account of the circumstances of his wounding was a suspect. The investigation process that followed a suspected self-inflicted wound involved military police, medical testimony, and a court-martial if the evidence was sufficient. The records of self-inflicted wound investigations show that the evidentiary standard was variable. Men were convicted on evidence that would not have sustained a conviction in a civilian court. Men were acquitted on evidence that the investigating officers clearly believed was insufficient to prove innocence, but was also insufficient to meet whatever threshold they applied to conviction. The inconsistency of the outcomes reflects the institutional discomfort with the category. Punishing men harshly for self-inflicted wounds required the institution to maintain the position that a man who could no longer endure the front line was a criminal rather than a casualty. As the war progressed, and the evidence of what extended frontline service did to the human mind accumulated in the medical records, this position became increasingly difficult to maintain with full conviction, and the inconsistency of the outcomes reflects that difficulty. The 19th routine was the management of the connection between the front and home, specifically the management of leave, which was not universal and not guaranteed, and which the records reveal was allocated and administered in ways that had significant and largely undocumented effects on the men it reached and the men it did not. Home leave for British soldiers, the actual passage back to Britain for a period of days, was not a regular or systematic feature of British Army management in the early years of the war. It was administered at the unit level, subject to operational requirements, and the rate at which individual men received it was highly variable. Men in units that spent extended periods in active sectors, or whose units could not be spared from the line, might go a year or more without leave. Men in more fortunate positions might return home every few months. The psychological significance of home leave was understood, at least partially, by the institution. Leave was recognized as a morale factor, and the extension of leave programs as the war progressed was motivated in part by the recognition that men who never left the front deteriorated faster than men who had some interval of removal from it. What the records do not capture, because the institution had no framework for it, was the specific and frequently devastating experience of leave itself. Men returning home found that the gap between their experience and the comprehension of those at home was not bridgeable in a few days' conversation. The things they had seen and done and endured could not be communicated in the vocabulary available to them. And if they had been communicable, the communicating would have served purposes that the institution's censorship apparatus was designed to prevent. The leave records show men going home. They do not show men trying to explain where they had been, failing, and returning to the front with a new layer of isolation. The knowledge that even those who loved them most could not understand what they were in the middle of. The return from leave was, for many men, a second bereavement. The men who had dreamed of home while at the front discovered that home was no longer entirely accessible to them, and then they got back on the troop train. The 20th routine is the one that every other routine on this list was building toward, and it is the one that the institutional records capture most completely while understanding least: the normalization itself. The process by which each of these conditions, the managed death, the classified sleep deprivation, the pharmaceutical sedation of the traumatized, the execution of the mentally broken, the bureaucratic processing of the missing, the institutional fiction of the official ration, the managed distance between what was happening and what was said to be happening, became, for the men inside the system and the institutions running it, simply the way things were. Normalization in an extreme environment is a documented psychological phenomenon. It is the mechanism by which human beings adapt to conditions that would, encountered suddenly and without preparation, produce paralysis. It is also the mechanism by which things that should never be acceptable become, through repetition and institutional framing and the sheer pressure of survival, acceptable enough to continue. The Western Front operated on this mechanism for 4 years. The men who ran the armies understood this to some degree and relied on it explicitly. The rotation system was partly designed to prevent normalization from running so deep that men became unable to function, by providing intervals of less extreme experience that reset the baseline. The rum ration and the other pharmaceutical interventions were tools for managing the edges of the normalization process, for keeping men on the functional side of the line between adapted and broken. The censorship apparatus was designed to prevent the normalization of one context, the front, from being transmitted to another context, the home front, in a way that would destabilize the home front's own normalization, its acceptance of the war as a necessary and manageable undertaking. The records that survive from World War I, the unit diaries, the medical reports, the casualty statistics, the court-martial records, the letters that passed through censorship and the letters that did not, the operational plans and the logistical tables and the ration returns are a comprehensive documentation of this normalization. They record, in extraordinary detail, how institutions manage the transformation of mass death into an administrative category, how the suffering of millions of individuals was processed through systems that had no mechanism for accounting for suffering as such, only for accounting for combat effectiveness and operational capacity and resource availability and the other metrics that the running of an industrial war required. The soldiers who survived the war returned to civilian societies that had been living inside a different normalization, the normalization of absence, of waiting, of reading the casualty lists, of the managed communication that the censorship apparatus had produced. The gap between these two normalizations was not bridgeable by any social or medical or institutional mechanism that existed in 1918 or 1919. The men came home. The institutions processed their demobilization with the same bureaucratic efficiency they had brought to their mobilization. The forms were filled, the pay was settled, the gratuities were calculated, the discharges were issued. What the men carried back with them, the specific texture of what the war had done to the interior architecture of their experience, the sounds and smells and images and physical sensations and moral weights that the front had deposited in them over months and years, the institution had no form for. It was not a category in any document. It did not appear in any return. It was not wastage because they had survived. It was not a casualty because they were alive. It was something the system had produced and could not account for, and had no intention of accounting for, because accounting for it would have required the institution to turn and look at what it had built and what it had required of the people inside it. And that was a direction the institution was not equipped to look. The war ended on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. The guns stopped. The silence, by all accounts, was profound and strange and almost intolerable after 4 years of continuous noise. Then, within days, the planning for demobilization began. The forms were printed, the processing centers were organized. The men moved through them in their hundreds of thousands, and the institution recorded their passage with the same efficiency it had brought to everything else. And the record of their interior lives remained what it had always been throughout the war, absent from the document, present only as a gap in the accounting, a thing that happened between the lines of the returns, unclassified, unprocessed, and unresolved. By the end of 1921, the last of the immediate post-war demobilization administration was complete. The pension claims had been filed and processed. The war graves had been registered, and the memorial construction had begun. The official histories were being written. The generals were writing their memoirs. The statesmen were writing theirs. The men who had stood in the trenches at 4 in the morning, watching the sky for the first sign of dawn and the beginning of the stand-to, had largely gone back to whatever they had come from. Their experiences were their own, unrecorded in any form the institution recognized, unaccounted for in any ledger. The war had consumed what it consumed, recorded what it recorded, and left the rest to silence. In the years that followed, new wars would inherit the same organizational principles, the same management frameworks, the same vocabulary of attrition and wastage and effectives, refined and updated, but recognizably continuous with what had been developed in the 4 years between 1914 and 1918. The machinery that World War I built for the industrial management of mass death did not end with the armistice. It was simply demobilized, archived, and made available for future use.